The Atlantic slave trade, a dark chapter in human history, was a complex network of trade relationships that forcibly displaced millions of Africans to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries. This trade not only reshaped the social and economic landscapes of the involved continents, but also left a permanent mark on their cultural and demographic profiles. Understanding its timeline and the breadth of its impact is crucial for grasping the profound changes it brought about. Initially, the trade started modestly in the 15th century, when European colonizers began to establish trade routes with West African kingdoms. The demand for labor in the burgeoning colonies in the Americas fueled an ever-growing thirst for human resources, leading to the extensive use of African slaves. This trade grew to involve multiple European nations, each establishing their own networks and trade routes across the Atlantic Ocean. The mechanics of the Atlantic slave trade were brutal.
Before we go on, we noticed that a lot of our viewers haven't subscribed, so please subscribe. It helps in the growth of our channel. Now back to the video.
Africans were captured or bought near the coast, then marched to forts where they would be held before enduring the harrowing Middle Passage across the Atlantic. This journey was marked by extreme suffering and high mortality rates, with survivors facing a life of hard labor in plantations, mines, and households across the Americas. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration into the origins, key players, economic motivations, and the eventual decline of the Atlantic slave trade. It's a story of human resilience and tragedy, economic greed, and the struggle for human rights that continues to resonate today.
What's your name?
Toby, with an I, with an accent over the I, and a little line over the O, so you know it's a long vowel sound and not a short one. And sometimes I like to dot the I with a little smiley face or a heart or something. Something to brighten the reader's day.
I asked you what your name was!
The origins of the Atlantic slave trade can be traced back to the mid-15th century, when Portuguese explorers, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, began to explore the West African coast. The initial interactions were primarily for gold and spices, but as European colonization expanded in the Americas, so did their need for labor. Slavery was not a new concept, but the scale and systematization seen in the Atlantic slave trade were unprecedented. By the late 15th century, Spain had also entered the fray, followed by other European powers such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands. These nations found that African slaves were ideal for the hard labor required in their Caribbean and South American colonies, where indigenous populations were dwindling due to disease and harsh working conditions. This marked the beginning of a transatlantic trade triangle involving European goods, African slaves, and American agricultural products. The involvement of these European nations was driven by economic interests, but it was also supported by a legal and religious framework that justified the enslavement of Africans. The papal bull issued in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal the right to reduce any Saracens, pagans, and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery, which laid a moral groundwork for the European colonization and enslavement practices. This early involvement set the foundations for what would become a deeply entrenched system affecting millions. The roles and responsibilities of the European nations involved would evolve over time, as would the resistance against this inhumane trade practice, leading to a complex historical narrative that underscores the interconnectedness of continents and peoples. The Atlantic slave trade was shaped by key figures and pivotal events. John Hawkins, an English navigator in the 1560s, was among the first to run the triangular trade. His actions intensified Britain's involvement in the slave trade. On the African side, King Zingambemba, or Afonso I, initially traded with the Portuguese. He later resisted the trade, highlighting its devastating impact on his people. The sugar revolution in the Caribbean increased the demand for labor and the import of African slaves. The Virginia slave codes of the 1660s institutionalized racial discrimination. These events illustrate the complexities and profound consequences of the Atlantic slave trade.
This economic perspective sheds light on why the Atlantic slave trade persisted for centuries despite its moral reprehensibility. The profits generated were immense and were deeply integrated into the economies of both the European colonizers and certain African kingdoms, creating a complex web of economic dependencies that was difficult to dismantle. However, this involvement often came at a great cost to the social and political stability of these regions, leading to increased warfare and corruption as factions vied for control of the slave trade. The economic benefits were also felt in African kingdoms that participated in the trade. African elites and traders gained wealth and power by selling prisoners of war or criminals to European traders. The wealth generated from this trade provided the capital for the Industrial Revolution in Europe, further entrenching the economic incentives to continue the trade. European nations benefited immensely from the trade, not just from the profits made from selling human beings, but also from the boost to their maritime and shipping industries. Cities like Liverpool and Bristol in Britain, Nantes in France, and Lisbon in Portugal thrived as major ports involved in the slave trade. The harsh labor required for these crops was supplied by African slaves, who were deemed more suited to the conditions than European laborers and more resistant to tropical diseases compared to the indigenous populations. The Atlantic slave trade was underpinned by strong economic motivations. The agricultural economies of the European colonies in the Americas were heavily reliant on labor-intensive crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton.
The human cost of the Atlantic slave trade is immeasurable, with estimates suggesting that as many as 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, with millions more dying during capture, confinement, or the passage.
The conditions aboard the slave ships were horrific, with individuals shackled tightly together, provided minimal food and water, and exposed to diseases that swept through the cramped quarters.
Personal accounts from slaves like Olaudah Equiano, who later bought his freedom and wrote a detailed autobiography, offer a window into the brutal realities of the slave experience.
Equiano's descriptions of the Middle Passage vividly depict the inhuman conditions and the psychological torment endured by the captives. His narrative, along with others, played a crucial role in humanizing the slaves and fueling the abolitionist movement.
Women and children, while often overlooked in the narratives of the slave trade, faced particular vulnerabilities. Women were frequently subjected to sexual exploitation and violence, and children separated from their parents were sold off into domestic servitude or labor, stripped of any familial support or protection.
These personal stories and accounts are vital for understanding the deeply personal and lasting impact of the slave trade on individuals and communities. They not only illuminate the resilience and agency of those who lived through such horrifying circumstances, but also serve as a poignant reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance.
The movement to abolish the Atlantic slave trade gained momentum in the late 18th century, driven by a combination of economic changes, religious convictions, and moral considerations.
In Britain, figures like William Wilberforce became prominent voices in the parliamentary campaign against the slave trade. The formation of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787 marked a significant organized effort to end the trade.
In the United States, the abolitionist movement was intertwined with religious movements and the work of freed slaves who became public advocates against slavery.
Frederick Douglass, a former slave who escaped and became a leading voice in the abolitionist movement, used his powerful oratory and writings to expose the realities of slavery and galvanize public opinion.
The abolitionist movement also saw significant contributions from women, both black and white, who participated in boycotts, wrote pamphlets, and organized women's abolitionist societies.
Their involvement highlights the role of grassroots activism in effecting social change, demonstrating that the movement was multifaceted and inclusive of various segments of society.
The efforts of these abolitionists culminated in significant legal victories, such as the British Slave Trade Act of 1807, which outlawed the slave trade in the British Empire, and the 13th Amendment in the United States, which abolished slavery altogether in 1865. These legal achievements, however, were not the end of the struggle, as they were followed by continued efforts to combat racial discrimination and achieve true emancipation and equality. The abolition of the Atlantic slave trade was a significant historical achievement, but its legacy continues to impact societies today.
The Americas were irrevocably altered, with African influences in culture, language, and religion.
Descendants of slaves contribute significantly to society despite ongoing challenges of racial discrimination.
In Africa, the effects were devastating, leading to population loss and economic stagnation.
The societal disruptions have had long-lasting effects, contributing to ongoing challenges in nation-building and development.
The trade prompts discussions about reparations and human rights.
Reflecting on the Atlantic slave trade, it is crucial to remember the human lives at the center of this narrative.
Je viens de la France où on danse la chenille, où on prend plus de